There is a question that historians have circled for 2 centuries, never quite daring to answer it with certainty. On the morning of June 18th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of the known world, who had redrawn the borders of Europe not once but many times, hesitated, he delayed, he waited. And in those hours of waiting, the fate of an empire slipped through his fingers like sand. The world knows what happened at Waterloo. What it has never fully understood is what happened before. And that silence, that 8-hour window of decisions unmade and orders undelivered, is where this story truly begins. Before the mud of Waterloo, before the exile, before the silence of St. Helena, there was the boy who burned with something that could not be contained by ordinary life. Napoleon Bonaparte was Corsican, not French by birth, and in the elite military academies of mainland France, that difference was noticed immediately. He was shorter than the others. His accent was foreign. His manners were not polished by gilded upbringing. The other boys mocked him. They saw a small, dark-eyed outsider who did not belong. What they failed to see, what nearly everyone around him failed to see, was the furnace burning behind those dark eyes. He read voraciously, obsessively. Military history, geography, mathematics, biographies of Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal. He was not memorizing facts. He was learning the architecture of dominance, the grammar of conquest. By the time he was a teenager, he had absorbed more strategic knowledge than officers 3 times his age, and yet the institutions around him saw curiosity. A footnote. A boy who did not quite fit the frame they had prepared for him. But that was not the whole truth. Not yet. He graduated from the military academy ahead of schedule. He was assigned as a junior artillery officer, a rank considered modest, even marginal. Artillery was technical work, mathematical, unglamorous. It lacked the prestige of the cavalry, the romance of the infantry officer's saber. It was the assignment given to men the institution did not fully know what to do with. It would become the foundation of everything. He studied the artillery with the same consuming intensity he had brought to everything before it. He understood that precise gun placement could transform a losing position into a winning one. He understood psychological momentum, the way an army's will could break before its body did. He saw warfare the way a composer sees a symphony, as a structure of moving forces that, arranged correctly, could produce a single overwhelming crescendo. In 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, he was 24 years old and he showed France what he was capable of. The city was held by royalist forces supported by British troops. Earlier commanders had failed repeatedly. Napoleon arrived, surveyed the terrain with those cold, measuring eyes, and within days had positioned his artillery with a precision the defenders simply could not answer. Toulon fell. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general overnight. He was 24 years old. He would not stop there. And what came next would not merely change his life. It would transform the world. Between 1796 and 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte conducted one of the most sustained campaigns of military and political genius in recorded history. He is not remembered merely as a general. He is remembered as a force, something closer to weather than to a man, an event that reshaped the landscape it moved through. The Italian campaign of 1796 announced him to Europe. He was given an underfed, underpaid, demoralized French army and within months turned it into a conquering force. His soldiers adored him with a ferocity that contemporaries found almost supernatural. He spoke to them as individuals. He remembered their names. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept. But he asked them to do things that should have been impossible. Forced marches of extraordinary length, maneuvers that defied conventional timing. And they did those things again and again because they believed that he would not ask for the impossible unless he had already seen the way through. The coalition powers of Europe organized themselves against him again and again. And again he broke them apart. Austerlitz in December 1805 remains perhaps the finest single day of military command in European history. Facing a larger combined Austro-Russian force on terrain he had studied for days in advance, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, making it appear vulnerable, inviting the enemy to push there. When they did, concentrating their strength on what they believed was his weakest point, he drove his main force through the center of their line like a blade through cloth. The alliance shattered. 3 emperors faced each other on that field. Only one left it in victory. He rebuilt the legal infrastructure of France. The Napoleonic Code, which he personally helped draft, became the foundation for the legal systems of dozens of nations across 3 continents. He reformed education, reorganized taxation, modernized the bureaucracy. He was not only fighting wars, he was constructing a civilization. But the further he stretched, the more the structure strained. And somewhere in the years of triumph, something began to shift. Something no one in his court could quite name, and that Napoleon himself perhaps never fully acknowledged. There is a paradox at the center of sustained success. It creates its own mythology, and the man inside the mythology begins to lose the ability to see clearly around it. Napoleon's marshals. Brilliant men in their own right, devout, nay, Soult, Lannes, had learned over years that he was right with a consistency that bordered on the supernatural. They had watched him read a battlefield at 100 paces and see things invisible to everyone else. Over time, a dangerous belief had calcified among those around him. Napoleon's judgment was not merely excellent. It was infallible. And Napoleon himself, perhaps, had begun to believe it. The Russian campaign of 1812 was the first great crack. He marched 600,000 men into Russia. The Russians refused to stand and fight. They retreated. They burned their own cities. They left scorched earth and empty roads. Napoleon's army, built for the decisive engagement that would end a campaign in a single afternoon, found itself chasing a ghost through an endless landscape that had no center to strike. By the time he reached Moscow, the city was largely empty. Winter arrived. The campaign collapsed. He returned to France with fewer than 100,000 of the men he had taken east. He raised new armies. He fought again. He showed in flashes the old brilliance. But something was different. The margin was thinner. The room for error had shrunk. And the men around him, many of them exhausted, some of them quietly beginning to question whether the emperor's vision was still what it had been, followed him with a loyalty that was now edged with a new and unspoken anxiety. In April 1814, the Allied powers entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was sent to the island of Elba. He was 44 years old. He had remade the world, and it had unmade him. But the story does not end there, because the story never ends where it seems to end. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba. He sailed to the south of France with roughly 1,000 men, a handful of cannon, and a belief, or perhaps a necessity, that he was not finished yet. The King of France sent troops to intercept him. History records what happened when those troops encountered Napoleon on the road near Grenoble. He dismounted, walked toward them alone, opened his coat, and said, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers dropped their rifles. They cheered. They joined him. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris. The Allied powers of Europe, meeting at the Congress of Vienna, declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized their armies. He had perhaps 90 days to win a war that would determine whether he ruled Europe or died in exile. He had to move faster than the Allied forces could concentrate. He had to defeat them before they could combine. He had to be Napoleon again, fully and without reservation, one last time. He marched north into Belgium in June 1815. On June 16th, he fought 2 engagements. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussian army under Marshal Blücher, driving them from the field. At Quatre Bras, his forces under Marshal Ney fought to a bloody standstill against Wellington's advanced troops. The Prussians had been beaten, but not destroyed, a distinction that would prove fatal. On June 17th, it rained, and on the morning of June 18th, when every general's instinct and every strategic necessity demanded that Napoleon attack Wellington's army at dawn, he waited. He waited for 8 hours, and no one, then or since, has ever fully explained why. June 18th, 1815. The fields around the village of Waterloo. Dawn came pale and gray over the plateau of Mont Saint-Jean. Wellington's army occupied the ridge there, their positions barely visible through the residual mist of the previous night's rain. Behind Napoleon's lines, 69,000 men waited in their formations, breath steaming, boots mud-caked from the sodden ground. Hundreds of cannon. One last chance. Napoleon had been awake for much of the night. Those who saw him in those pre-dawn hours describe a man who was both himself and somehow removed from himself. He reviewed maps. He questioned officers. He issued preliminary orders, then amended them. He said the ground was too wet from the previous day's rain for artillery to advance effectively. He said they needed to wait for the soil to firm up. It was not an unreasonable concern. But the hours passed. Marshal Soult, his chief of staff, pressed him. Officers noted the urgency with a growing unease they struggled to voice in the presence of the emperor. Every hour they waited was an hour in which the Prussians, beaten but not destroyed at Ligny, could recover, reorganize, and march to reinforce Wellington. Napoleon knew this. Everyone around him knew this. He waited. He had his breakfast served on fine china, an act of deliberate calm, or perhaps a performance that became legendary in the accounts that followed. He reviewed his troops in a ceremonial manner that suggested confidence and ease. He told those around him that Wellington was a poor general, that the English were poor troops, that the encounter would be over by lunchtime. He waited. It was past 11 o'clock in the morning when the French artillery finally opened fire and the Battle of Waterloo began. What happened in those 8 hours? The ground, some historians argue. A strategic miscalculation, others contend. Physical exhaustion. There are accounts of ailments that compromised his characteristic energy in those final days of the campaign. There are those who suggest the paralysis was psychological rather than physical. A man who had spent his life moving faster than his enemies suddenly unable to summon the old urgency. A man who had outrun his own legend and found in that damp Belgian dawn that he did not know who he was without it. There is one account, disputed, unverifiable, and haunting in its simplicity, that one of Napoleon's most trusted advisors spoke privately with him in the early morning hours and delivered a warning so stark, so specific about the strategic consequences of delay, that it shook even Napoleon's confidence. The advisor reportedly told him that Marshal Blucher's Prussians would reach the battlefield before the battle was decided. That delay was not a choice. It was a sentence. Napoleon is said to have listened in complete silence. Then he sent the man away and waited some more. Whether this conversation happened as described cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is that the advisor chose to remain silent afterward. For the rest of his life, he said almost nothing about those hours. His memoirs describe the preparations for Waterloo in careful, almost administrative language. Then step with particular deliberateness around the question of why it all began so late. That silence told its own story. And the meaning of that silence would only become clear later to those who read between the lines. The battle itself lasted approximately 9 hours. Wellington's defensive position was strong. He had placed his infantry behind the ridge in a characteristic formation, hiding their numbers, absorbing the French advance before revealing the full weight of their response, patient where Napoleon was accelerative, immune to panic in a way that unnerved his opponents. The French attacked the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont on the right flank, intending to draw Wellington's reserves there and weaken the center. The attack became a consuming siege that swallowed French troops for hours without achieving its objective. The center held. The infantry attacks against the ridge produced slaughter on both sides. French columns drove forward through grapeshot. They reached the ridge. They pushed. They were pushed back. The cavalry charge of Marshal Ney, sent too early, without infantry support, into the teeth of British defensive squares, broke like water against stone. Thousands of horses and men piled against formations that refused to dissolve. And in the late afternoon, as the fighting on the ridge reached a desperate equilibrium, the first Prussian troops appeared on the eastern flank. Blucher had come. The man who had been beaten 2 days before, who should have needed days to recover, had marched his army through the night and arrived precisely where Napoleon's advisor had warned he would arrive. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's final reserve, the elite of the elite, men who had never been defeated, went forward in a last assault on the ridge. They climbed the slope. They reached the crest. And there, for the first time in their history, they were stopped. They broke. They ran. When the Imperial Guard ran, the French army saw it and understood what it meant. The panic that had always lived at the edge of battle, suppressed by discipline and belief in the Emperor's invincibility, finally broke free. The retreat became a rout. A rout became a dissolution. Napoleon fled the field as the Allied cavalry pursued the disintegrating remnants of his army through the darkening Belgian countryside. He had watched the guard break and said, in a voice that those near him described as very quiet, "Come. The battle is lost." He was 45 years old. He would never command an army again. And the 8 hours of that morning, those silent, unaccountable hours of fine china and ceremony and delay, had made the difference between what happened and what might have been. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, 800 miles from the nearest landmass. There would be no Elba this time, no escape, no second return. The Allied powers had learned that lesson. He lived there for 6 years. He dictated his memoirs. He walked in the limited garden the British allowed him. He argued with his custodian. He grew smaller physically in that diminishing world. The weight falling from him gradually, the energy that had once seemed inexhaustible draining into the damp air of that isolated rock in the South Atlantic. In those 6 years, he constructed the legend of Napoleon. The memoirs rewrote the defeats as near victories undone by treachery or circumstance. Waterloo became the fault of Ney's premature cavalry charge, of Marshal Grouchy's failure to pursue the Prussians after Ligny, of the rain. The decisions of the morning of June 18th were not discussed in any depth. The hours were accounted for by the weather, by the ground, by the logistics of artillery movement. He never, in those 6 years of dictation and reflection, said, "I waited too long, and I knew it, and I could not stop myself." Some who study those memoirs, who read them alongside the other accounts from men who were present that morning, believe that something was unspoken there, something that Napoleon had seen clearly, in which he had neither the language nor the will to commit to paper. The possibility that the emperor in those pre-dawn hours at Waterloo had understood exactly what he was doing, had understood the risk, had perhaps understood at some level beneath conscious thought that the gamble was already lost, and had proceeded anyway, not out of ignorance, out of something more human, more complex, and more heartbreaking than ignorance. He died on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. His last reported words carried a quality of reaching of incomplete return, a man arriving somewhere familiar at the end. Some accounts record him saying names, his son, old battle sites, perhaps Josephine. Whatever he said at the end, it was not about Waterloo. It was not about the 8 hours. It was not about fine china on a wet Belgian morning while the clock ran and the Prussians marched. Some silences are so complete that they speak more clearly than any words could. The man who spoke most carefully around those hours was Marshal Soult, who had urged speed and been ignored. Soult's accounts of that morning read like dispatches from a man trying to describe a fire without using the word flame. The delay is mentioned. The necessity of waiting for firmer ground is offered as explanation. The time is noted. And then the subject is moved past with a quiet, careful deliberateness that itself tells a story. A colonel of the guard, whose diary was preserved in a private archive in Normandy and eventually published in the late 20th century, wrote something more direct. He had been near Napoleon's command post in the early morning hours. He had observed the emperor sitting in unusual stillness, uncharacteristic stillness, for a man whose physical energy in preparation for battle had always been almost compulsive. Pacing, dictating, riding ahead to the terrain, returning, revising. That morning, the colonel wrote, Napoleon sat, he drank his coffee. He did not pace. When officers approached him with urgent requests for orders, he answered briefly and returned to stillness. The colonel wrote that he had served with Napoleon for 11 years and had never seen him look like that. And then he stopped mid-sentence in his diary and added 4 words he did not explain. Il savait déjà. He already knew. Knew what, the colonel never said. The diary ends shortly after. Whether it was ever finished, or whether the colonel chose to leave that sentence incomplete, cannot be determined. But those 3 words carry in them the entire weight of what Waterloo might mean beyond its tactical and political dimensions. They suggest a man who had seen, with the clarity that comes to exhausted brilliance in its final hours, exactly how the day would end. Who had understood that the gap between victory and defeat had narrowed beyond recovery, not in the moments of battle, but in the months and years before it, in the attrition of Russia, in the erosion of the officer corps, in the fundamental shift of European reality that meant no single victory, however brilliant, could hold the continent against its own collective interests. He may have known that the Prussians would arrive in time. He may have known that the dawn attack, the attack that every strategic principle demanded, that the advisors urged, that the clock screamed for, would simply arrive at the same destination a few hours earlier. And knowing this, he had breakfast served on fine china, and reviewed his troops with ceremony, and told the men around him that Wellington was a poor general, and the English were poor troops, and it would all be finished by lunchtime. Because that was what emperors did, even at the end. 200 years after Waterloo, the field is a quiet place. There is a museum. There is a large artificial hill, constructed in the years after the battle, with a lion at its top. Tourists walk the ground on summer days, trying to picture what it looked like when the cannon fired and the infantry formed and 150,000 men decided the fate of Europe in a single afternoon. The question that hangs over that ground, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, is the question the colonel left incomplete in his diary. He already knew. Knew what? And if he knew, what does it mean that he proceeded anyway? What does it mean for how we understand Napoleon, or ambition, or the strange territory a person enters when they have pushed further than anyone before them and find themselves at the edge of what will and intelligence can accomplish? Perhaps it means that greatness and limitation are not opposites, that the same qualities that carry a person to extraordinary heights, the consuming certainty, the refusal to accept what others accept as impossible, the willingness to demand the impossible from those who follow, eventually become at the margin a form of exhaustion, not a failure of character. Something more like the cost of character. The price paid, over time, for being what he was. Napoleon Bonaparte began as an outsider who refused to accept the world's assessment of what he could accomplish. He ended as the most powerful insider in European history, a man who could no longer afford the energy of refusal. He had spent it all. On the fields of Italy and Egypt and Austerlitz and Jena and Wagram and the endless, frozen, burning miles of Russia. By June 18, 1815, the account was perhaps already drawn. The 8 hours were not simply a mistake. They were an ending, quiet, personal, interior, and in their way, more revealing of who Napoleon Bonaparte truly was than any of the victories that preceded them. He sat in the Belgian morning with his coffee and his fine china and his exhaustion, and he watched the clock move, and somewhere in his extraordinary mind, that mind that had seen through every fog of war, every feint, every deception, he may have seen exactly what was coming, and he let it come. That is the story of Waterloo that history almost never tells, not the story of a general's miscalculation, the story of a man who had become so completely his own legend that even he, in the end, could not find his way back to the person inside it. Some battles are lost on the field. Some are lost in the silence before the cannon fires. Napoleon Bonaparte understood both kinds better than anyone. That is why, 2 centuries later, we are still asking the question he left unanswered. Sitting in the pre-dawn quiet of a Belgian June morning, fine china on the table, 50,000 men waiting in the mist, the emperor very still, and time running, and the Prussians already on the march. He already knew.